Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Power Wash Simulator. Let's rant with Scrapper. It's been a while since I've had you guys watching me because didn't have anything to rant about, and now I kind of do. So I'll go ahead and rant. But I was like listening to other videos while I was cleaning stuff. I started doing a skate park that's actually really cool and super filthy, um, and I said, well, I'll just restart it, and I didn't want to start you guys in the middle of a job, so because you can't then you can't see the before and after as well. There's no way to restart jobs. You can restart challenges, but you can't restart the campaign. So anyway, so here we are at the firehouse. One thing I do want to mention because I felt this happen a lot at the skate park. Um, I've tried to actually do the washing most of the time kind of the way you would do it in real life. Normally, from what I've seen with power washing, you kind of start up and work your way down. And the reason you do that is the water is going to flow down. And so if, let's say, this driveway was messy, if you clean this up and then you go up here and start washing out the top, it's going to destroy the job you did down below, right? But of course, nothing actually stays permanently dirty after you clean it. So if we wash this part up here, it will run. It'll look like it's running down, but then it vanishes. So if you're actually up and you're doing something like sweeping the nozzle back and forth, you start washing parts of the down areas, and it like I don't know, it's just kind of messy looking. And so I'm actually probably going to start low and work up instead of starting up and working down, at least like inside. I don't know if you can go inside. Maybe you can't go inside. Are we just cleaning the outside of this thing? I guess we're just cleaning the outside. So let's walk around, take a look, and then we'll start our rant. But let's take a look at what we got here. So we got this tower here, and that scaffold can help us with that, I guess. And then we've got this part, and then we're going to have to probably go up onto the roof. And that we can actually start at the top and work our way down because nothing we do up on the roof is going to affect the walls. So let's put the ladder up, and we can go up here and take a look. Oh yeah, it's pretty filthy up there. I like this game, but I do not like the way climbing works. It's very awkward. Are we going to be able to climb up this thing? We can take a look at the top, absolute highest point. Oh yeah, we can. All right, so this is how it's going to start, and we're going to clean it up. And as we go, we're going to rant about today. What we're going to talk about is starting. Let's see if we can use a bigger nozzle. Starting new players in a game. And so here you can see, by the way, you see how we've created an opening by doing the top part. That's what I was talking about. Anyway, so what I want to talk about is how to introduce players to a game and sort of the do's and don'ts of kind of how one should go about doing that. And this actually comes up. I'm almost never critical of Pinnacle Games because I love them and they're the guys that make Savage Worlds. But this actually came up on the Pinnacle forums when discussing. They have a solo adventure called Crater Lake. And in that adventure, you're playing by yourself, and it's like a choose-your-own-adventure, much like I did with the Call of Cthulhu solo adventures. The Call of Cthulhu solo adventures were things like Alone Against the Flames and Alone Against the Tide. And so this is just, it's a solo adventure where you just read paragraphs of text, and then sometimes it'll say if you do this, make a skill check. If you do that, make this other skill check. And they do a little bit of combat and that sort of thing in the Call of Cthulhu game, not much. And so, so Crater Lake is a hardcover book. I bought the hardcover as well as the PDF, although I mostly use the PDF to do the adventure. I actually recorded it and was going to post it like I did with the Call of Cthulhu ones, and I have to say, didn't like it very much, and so I was getting frustrated with it, and I just said, you know what, I'm not going to post this because I was just, like, I got partway through it, and I was like, I just want this thing to end, and I'm not enjoying it, so why would I post that? And so I never did post it. And so let's talk about why, because somebody else complained about it, and The problem with it is designed to teach you Savage Worlds and Deadlands, right? The Savage Worlds system and the Deadlands setting. But the opening in particular, and I think the adventure just in general, is not well designed for new players. Now, I wasn't a total noob to Savage Worlds, um, and I knew plenty about it from having watched it be played on the Wildcards channel, and I'd read all the rules and everything, so I wasn't a complete and total noob. But I was still fairly new to the game. And the problem really isn't me, right? The question here is, did they create something that would be good for new players? I would argue that it's self-evidently the case because I had seen much less of Call of Cthulhu being played, but had no issue at all with the Call of Cthulhu solo books. That the Call of Cthulhu books are actually quite good for new players, but I don't think Crater Lake is. And so what I want to discuss is, what do you do to help new players learn a game, right? What things can help them and what things can actually harm them? And then we'll talk about what I think Crater Lake did wrong. Um, I think that when you're trying to start new players off in a game, in a role-playing game, you have to be very careful. Why am I having trouble backing up with this character? This shouldn't be. Okay. You have to be careful how you do it when you introduce somebody to a new game. And I also want to point out there are two different kinds of new players, right? There's the new player who has played D&D and now you're teaching them champions, right? And so they understand basic role-playing game mechanics, but they may not know the champions mechanics, right? So that's one type of new player. Too close here. And then there's the completely new player, somebody who's completely new to role-playing games, right? Who may not have any idea about what skill rolls and two-hit rolls and damage rolls even are, right? And so they're completely new to role-playing games, just period, as a general proposition. And so, like, that's two different audiences. So you have to kind of be cognizant of that. I would say that two audiences present very sort of different challenges, but they both present challenges, right? The D&D player who's learning to play champions is going to have a lot of assumptions about how the role-playing game of champions will work that will be completely incorrect. Or let's use Savage Worlds as an example, right? My players were playing, I've mentioned this, we're playing in like a short temporary campaign, and because it's short, and I know my best friend loves to advance, I said, okay, you guys will just advance after every session. So he's loving that. So they did their first advance. We got, like I said, everybody do your advance before we get together again. And I left the, I've been leaving our world up in Foundry, which I didn't do with the D&D game because they were doing all of their stuff in D&D Beyond, and then we were importing it, right? But there is no Savage Worlds Beyond that we can use to import. I mean, there's Savage.us, but I don't know if you can import stuff. And so they've just been doing everything on Foundry, right? So I said, go ahead and do your advances. And so the one woman who knows a lot about D&D but never played it or know anything about Savage Worlds, she was like, well, I added my new edge. But like it didn't do anything like go up in hit points or anything. And I said, you don't go up in hit points in Savage Worlds. There's no such thing as hit points. Every character can only take 3 wounds before going incapacitated, and that's it. There are some types of exceptions for certain NPCs, but I don't think there are any conditions under which a player character can ever have more than 3 wounds before going incapacitated. And so she was like, oh, okay, so this is an assumption that you make, right? Your assumption would be that your character could possibly be changing in a way that allows them to take more hits from the enemy, right? So, so in a sense, I always remember my history teacher when she was teaching us U.S. history saying you have to unlearn all of the wrong and incorrect stuff that you've learned from like legends and things like that, like Washington chopping down the cherry tree, right? You need to unlearn that and learn the actual real history. And when you're like somebody who's been playing role playing game number one and you come back and you're now learning role playing game number two, those people have to unlearn all of the things that they think are true of the new game, but aren't, because the new game doesn't work that way, right? And so, how are we doing here? Yeah, we're doing all right. And so, they might know a lot of role playing game basics, but they're also going to think they know things that are true that really aren't. So they might be very confident in stuff that's completely wrong, the way my students often are in class, right? They're completely confident in their wrong answer on the test, right? And that leads to them being more likely to get wrong answers, because when you're confident in what you don't know, then you're not as likely to look for like, well, how does it really work? New players won't be confident in what they think they know, right? And so it's a little easier to sort of teach them the rules in a sense, because they know they don't think they know the wrong rules that are wrong, right? But they also don't know the basics, so they won't know what a skill check is and that kind of thing. So you have those two types of players: one who's making incorrect assumptions about the game but knows how role-playing games work, and one who doesn't really know how role-playing games work and isn't making incorrect assumptions but doesn't know how they work, right? And so, so you have to be careful with how you start the group out when you have a bunch of new people who don't know how to play the game, right? And my recommendation to any GM who is starting new players out is, your first several sessions, you should do everything you can to make sure that all of the challenges and encounters are, for lack of a better term, completely vanilla. That is to say, don't put the player characters up against enemies that have very weird and unusual abilities, because the players aren't in any real position to know how to deal with that. If we go back to a Champions example, right, we know that in the game Champions, there are what we call normal defenses and normal attacks, and these do normal damage, right? Stun and body damage against PD and ED. That is the normal way that you do attacks and damage in Champions, right? And these attacks work against offensive and defensive combat value, and every character sheet has an offensive and a defensive combat value on the character sheet, and everybody is going to kind of know a little bit about that. And most characters, this is the key, most player characters in Champions, especially player characters designed by new players, are going to have normal attacks and normal defenses, right? And so what you have to be careful not to do is put these players up against enemies with unusual, hard-to-defend abilities, because unusual and hard-to-defend abilities are unusual and hard to defend against, right? And the players are not in a position to be ready to defend against those kinds of abilities. You see what I'm saying? Because they don't know the game yet. So it's perfectly valid for a game master to have villains with, say, a darkness field that can cover the whole battlefield, and if you don't have enhanced senses, you're going to have trouble handling the darkness field. With players who are experienced in Champions, they know how to handle it. But a bunch of new players aren't going to know how to handle that, and you could end up just crushing them. They're going to get frustrated, right? They won't know all of the alternative ways of handling enemies that experienced players might know, right? So if they have regular attacks, well, enemies should have regular defenses. And so what I would say is, like, your first Champions adventure, you might want to have them just go up against a brick, right? He's got physical and energy defense, yes, but When they see how high his physical and energy defenses are, these players will probably have characters who have non-standard attacks too, right? Like no normal defense attacks and ego attacks and stuff, and they'll turn those on the brick, and they should work, right? Because it's a brick. He's not going to have mental powers and stuff like that. But if you put them up against somebody who has, say, hardened defenses against armor piercing, who has the defense against their NND, who has energy, ego, physical damage reduction, which reduces even the damage that gets through their defenses, right? Look, I've had champions players fight against enemies, right? Overlord, my mega villain, had hardened defenses, very high PDED, energy damage reduction to against half energy damage reduction to help protect him against NNDs. He had powered armor. He had mental defenses. He had presence. He had presence defense. Like, he didn't have any weaknesses. They still beat him, but they were experienced. Even when they were in high school, they were still experienced champions players. You don't want to put the player characters up against something with weird, hard to defend abilities that just aren't the usual like parry and toughness from Savage Worlds, because new players aren't going to know how to deal with that. They can barely deal with the mechanics of the game to begin with, right? So I would say always start out with standard stuff, and then if you want to add complications, do that in a later encounter after the players are used to the basic rules, right? There's a reason why if you look at, say, the basic set of D&D or the starter set, they only give you certain rules and not the rest of them. Why? Because they don't want to overly complicate things for new players, right? So if you're teaching people a game, you want to make it easy for them to get into. Right? I always remember when I was a kid, and even with board games, and I was teaching somebody a complex game like Risk or Stratego, I would teach them the rules, and then I don't know if this is weird to admit or not, but I would throw the game. I learned early on that people like to win and succeed, and a new player is going to get frustrated if I just turn all of my Stratego-y or risky ability on them and crush them, which you could do, right? Or you're teaching somebody chess and you scholars mate or you fools mate them. Well, that's not going to be fun for them. They're going to be embarrassed. They're going to feel crappy, right? If you want them to play chess, you're going to need them to enjoy chess. And you can't make them feel lousy by teaching them the game and then wrecking them. And since the same thing with, say, champions, you teach somebody how to play champions and then you put a nasty villain like Firewing against them in the opening battle, right? That's just going to frustrate them. They're not going to be able to beat him. Even if their character statistically could, they don't have the player skill to defeat somebody like Firewing right out of the gate. Okay? So you want to make sure that you don't frustrate your players by having them face a challenge that is too hard, and it just makes them lose in a way that's embarrassing or not fun, right? So you always want to give them a fairly simple challenge, and a challenge that can easily be handled by new characters who don't have any extra special abilities. Okay? And I think that's actually really important to do. So, so that's kind of the basics of my advice. So now let's talk a little bit about the Deadlands solo adventure and why it's a bad adventure. And then I'm going to contrast it with the Call of Cthulhu solo adventures and why they're good ones. And even though these are solo adventures, the same rules still apply to making up adventures for your players when you're a GM. So the first thing that's like mistake number one is they don't give you enough information before you actually turn the page to start the adventure. They don't give you the kind of information that a good GM would give you. All right. What they don't tell you, but is critically important, okay, is that I'm trying to get this to line up here. I'm a little OCD, and well, you guys know that, and I actually really like making a nice line. I love doing that. I actually like watching. One of the reasons I got this game is there are actually channels on YouTube where people are doing this and they film themselves doing it, and I watch those. I love it. Um, it's funny. I don't like to clean myself, but like in real life, but I love doing stuff like this. Anyway, um, so they don't tell you enough to start, right? I think that's one of the main problems. They, uh, it's set in Colorado in the winter in the mountains, and what they don't tell you is if during character creation, if you don't choose to give yourself a winter coat and long johns and stuff like that, that you're going to have to make a vigor roll. Well, either way, you're going to have to make a vigor roll to survive the cold. And if you fail it, right, if you don't have the necessary equipment, you have to make the vigor roll at -2 or -4, depending on what equipment you have and don't have. And if you fail it, you're going to take 1 or 2 levels of fatigue, right, which is extremely debilitating in Savage Worlds. It's very hard to heal from fatigue, right? The only way to heal from cold-based fatigue like that would be to get out of the cold and into the warmth. So right off the bat, they've set you up to fail because they didn't tell you that you were going to need the winter clothing. So how would you know, right? I didn't know. So as soon as I read that, I was like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and buy this stuff because, a good game master would tell their players, my players are in Colorado in the winter. I told them, be aware, it's winter, right? Make sure we went over the rules of cold. And that if you're out in the cold for more than a certain number of hours without the proper clothing, you have to make a vigor roll, you can take levels of fatigue, and so on and so forth. So they all bought like long johns and winter coats because I knew it would be unfair to put them in a situation like that and not give them the opportunity, right? You're sitting there with $200 spare in your pocket that you didn't spend, and you could have bought a winter coat if you'd known you were going up into the mountains in the winter, right? So I told them it's January in Colorado, expect it to be cold, and buy the appropriate equipment, right? And I suggest, winter coat, long johns, whatever you want to do. And so they were prepared. But it doesn't tell you that at the beginning before the adventure starts. It just says if your character packed long johns or a winter coat, give yourself a regular vigor roll. If you didn't, it's at -2 or whatever. And so that, that's frustrating right out of the gate. I think that's bad design. That's not the GM. Who was it? As RB or Kievar? Somebody said when we were talking about whether the GM should be neutral or not. I guess that's a neutral GM. Yeah, that's why you don't do it. You don't do that. And one of them said, was it Matt Colville or Matt Mercer? I can't remember who said the GM should be fans of the player characters. Well, you're sure not being a fan of my player character if you didn't tell me that this adventure is going to require me to have winter clothing. You should be telling your players that. So step number 1 is you don't want to put a bunch of new players into a tough situation like that without giving them the proper assistance so that they know. A new player isn't going to have, even if they read the rules quickly, they're not going to have internalized enough of the rules to know, okay, this is Colorado in the winter, and so therefore we have to have, we have to look through the book and find the right clothing, right? They might not think about that. Vigor rolls, what are those? What's fatigue? Is it bad? I don't even know how it works. You see what I mean? And so this is, again, an adventure meant for new players. And the first thing they do out of the gate is not warn you about an important environmental hazard mechanic that a regular player is not going to have internalized those mechanics. That's something the GM reads up on. Players don't read up on. They're not supposed to have a working knowledge. They're not expected to have a working knowledge of how environmental hazards or traps work, because that's the GM's area, right? Their job is to be a player character and to react to the situations they're in as realistically in character as they can, right? Their job is not to spend time learning the mechanics of something like fatigue. That's the GM's job. So I found that very frustrating, and I would say as a GM, you shouldn't do something like that. Right? So don't start them off in a situation in which just the typical standard equipment that you would start with in a game is not sufficient, but you didn't tell them that. Okay? So that's problem number one. Then you get into this mining town or camp or whatever it was. You get into it, and the very first thing that happens, and by the way, spoiler alert, guys, this is going to tell you everything about the adventure. So if you want to play the adventure and you want to go in cold without any knowledge of what's coming, don't listen to this. Don't listen to the next several minutes of this live play, because I'm going to be revealing spoilers. So the next thing that happens is you come into this mining camp, and there's snow, and so the snow makes it difficult terrain, which means you're moving at half pace. So now, as a new player, and you're also DMing for yourself, right? GMing for yourself. So you have to understand all the mechanics because there's nobody else to help you. They're opening the entire adventure. I think, let's go with the smaller one here because it seems like we're not fully cleaning up the edges. They open the adventure with, okay, we have to do the cold mechanics, and now on top of that, we're going to do snow and difficult terrain. So now you have to worry about fatigue, cold, snow, difficult terrain, all in the first encounter. And then a zombie-like creature called Big Arms Bendy comes to attack you. And he's pretty tough for a starting player who's solo. Now, you're a wild card. He's not a wild card. Okay, all I got to do is do a wound to him, right? So my first character was a Chi Master. I'm like, okay, I close with him to do melee, and I'm going to beat him up, right? So I hit him, and I did a wound. I'm like, that should take care of him. Okay, if you wound him, turn to this page. You turn to the page, and it says, did you hit him in his, like, where did you hit him? And I guess if you weren't aiming for something, right, you just randomly roll. And if you don't hit him in the head, he gets back up. And basically, you have to, it takes several blows to figure out you've got to hit him in the head, right? If you don't hit him in the head, even if you do, and a headshot does extra damage, if you don't hit him in the head, and by the way, it's -4 to hit somebody in the head. So now you have a brand new character at -4, right? How are they going to, with maybe their D6 in fighting, how are they going to hit? You have a -4, and if you don't hit him in the head, he just gets back up. So he killed my character, my Kung Fu monk, my Chi Master. So then I said, okay, let me try a Huckster. Killed the Huckster. I finally did a Gunslinger, and I finally realized I got to kite this guy because it's in the snow and it's difficult terrain, so he can't get to me that fast. So I had to, and they start him like 10 squares away or something. So I had to like shoot and back up, shoot and back up, shoot and back up. I barely defeated him. Now, after you defeat him, what you find out after you look through the town is that there are wounded miners hiding in the buildings, and if you escape into one of the buildings, you could recruit them to help, and they have some guns and stuff, and they could shoot at him for you. And you could use them to help you take him out. But before you go to explore those buildings, there really isn't any good way for you to know that, right? How would you know that? It does say at one point maybe you should flee and try to get help, but they've already established that this seems to be a deserted camp. I think it's as if you flee into one of the buildings, turn to this page. So, like, there's a little bit of a hint. But, you know, the instinct of most players, especially in the first battle of the game, is not to flee. Right? And so they start this encounter off with an unusual mechanic, which is that a wound isn't a wound, right? There are very, very few creatures that are extras in Savage Worlds where if you do a wound to them but don't shoot them in the head, they get back up and keep fighting. There are a few in Deadlands. Nosferatus, I think, have to be shot in the heart because they're vampires. Some zombies have to be shot in the head or decapitated or whatever to keep them down. In fact, I'm watching a Let's Play of Coffin Rock, which is the adventure I have my team on, right? So I'm watching what another group of people did just to like compare. And the one guy, the Rattlesnake Kid, he's super funny. Every time they kill a zombie, he decapitates it because he believes that he said he read somewhere, or there was a legend or whatever that he read that if you chop the head off a zombie, it kills it for good. If you don't, they can get back up. So you could maybe there are maybe some creatures like that, but the vast majority of creatures don't have that ability to get back up. So here you have a brand new player who might be at like -1 or 2 because of fatigue. They're going to be at -4 to hit because it's got to be a headshot. So now you're looking at -5 or 6? How in the world is a brand new player character who's solo, unless they have some kind of magic ability like boost shooting, right? How are they going to hit on -5 or 6? Right? And so what you're really supposed to do here is go get help. That's, I think, really what they expect you to do. So that you're out there essentially tanking Big Arms Bendy while the 4 or 5 NPCs in the cabins are shooting at him with their shotguns and stuff. And eventually they'll get him in the head, right? With that many people shooting at you, somebody's going to ace and roll high enough to hit, and then they're going to take you out. But the problem is that, like, what if the player doesn't think to do that? I didn't think to do it the first 2 times. And I got very frustrated. And so this is what I'm saying. With new players, you don't want to start them off with something super unusual, some sort of a weird mechanic. Let me give you another example. I was getting ready for my Deadlands game, and my group, I think I mentioned this, I can't remember now, but my group wanted to explore a cemetery at night. Now, the town they're in is fear level 3 right now, and according to this scenario, when it hits fear level 4, there is stuff going on in the cemetery at night. But at fear level, you can see that I'm crooked here. At fear level 3, there's not much happening. But they wanted to explore it, and I said, well, there should be something. I'm like, they should get something for their effort. It shouldn't just be, they go out and they don't find anything. So I put a couple of ghouls in there. But before I did the ghouls, I was going to have them fight a flock of crows, a murder of crows. I actually built them. It's a swarm, right? And there was going to be like a large swarm template that would split into 2 medium blast templates that would then split each into 2 more small blast templates before they were able to kill them. Shouldn't be hard for a posse to do with guns and knives and stuff. But then I read up on the swarm mechanics. I was like, wait a minute. Bullets and knives actually don't work on them. You have to like stomp them or use crushing weapons. And, it's fine. I've watched experienced Deadlands players handle swarms with no problem. But these are not experienced players, and this would be the first combat of our entire campaign. Other than the, example combat they did with pre-made characters during Session 0. And I thought that's just, it's going to frustrate them, right? This is a weird mechanic. It's an unusual mechanic. By the way, it's used in Hollow's Last Hope. The first battle that in Pathfinder for Savage Worlds that the characters in Hollow's Last Hope get into is a swarm encounter against, a swarm of insects or something. I think that's a bad idea, too. Because, again, it's weird mechanics. You can't just take out your sword and stab them. And it's okay to have encounters where you can't just take out your sword and stab it, but not the first encounter. Don't wrongfoot the players when they don't even know the mechanics of the game. You wrongfoot them after they know the mechanics, when they're experienced at the game and they know what they're doing. Then they're equipped as players to handle the thinking outside the box that this encounter requires. I had a lot of other criticisms of the Crater Lake module. One person was saying the later chapters are better, and I think they are. I did manage to successfully complete it. But man, it was a struggle because in addition to taking care of your own PC and the enemies, in many scenes you're also handling NPC allies. Now they did that because Savage Worlds isn't really designed to be played solo, and they didn't really change the rules of Savage Worlds the way like people who do these solo game rules do to accommodate the soloing, except a little bit with how bennies work. And so I guess they figured you're going to need help. We'll give you some NPCs. But now you have a brand new player slash GM who has to do the difficult job of both playing and GMing for himself or herself. And on top of that, they've got a whole bunch of ally NPCs to keep track of. And they tried to do this as kind of a showcase for all the mechanics. I think there's a dramatic task. I know there's a chase that was very awkward and hard to do. But I feel like in each case, they made it a non-standard chase, right? It wasn't just a chase. You were flying a vehicle that had guns, and some of your allies could man the guns, and like you could make repair rolls on the vehicle and all this stuff. It's like, that's too much. Just have a chase on horseback. Repairing vehicles and manning guns is too much. If you want to teach me the chase rules, just have me chase somebody on horseback, right? It's simple, it's easy to understand, and it's not as super complicated as the stuff that they're having you do in this weird steampunk vehicle, right? And so, yeah, I had a lot of problems with that adventure. I actually was pretty critical of it on the forum, and I was surprised I got a couple of likes in my post when I talked about it. But yeah, the original poster was complaining. He's like, what the heck is this? How is a new player supposed to do this? He said, I've died 3 times. And, you know, the same thing I did. He died 3 times before he figured out, oh, you got to go run for help. Even if you want to do that, like have a battle that's too hard and you have to run for help, like do that in the second or third encounter. For the first encounter, just let me shoot somebody, right? Just let me fight a standard fight so that I learn how acing works, how damage and toughness and parry work, how range versus melee attacks work, how the action deck works. Isn't that enough? Why on top of that do I have to understand fatigue, difficult terrain, weird hit location rules, right? Do that later in the second chapter or the third chapter after you're sure the player has played a few encounters successfully and survived them and learned how to do them. I know it's hard to create a choose-your-own-adventure style solo game, but let's look at how Call of Cthulhu did it. And I think this is one of the big differences. In Call of Cthulhu, they provide you with example characters, with pre-gen characters. And they tell you you can do your own, but here's a pre-gen. I tried to do my own in one of them. And what I found was that the adventure required certain skills that I didn't have. And you don't get extra cool options when you don't have those skills. You can still complete it, but you're going to miss a lot of cool stuff. And so what I realized is, okay, they gave me these pre-gens to be sure that I would have the skills I needed to complete the adventures. By the way, my characters all died in Call of Cthulhu, but I wasn't frustrated the way I was in Crater Lake. Because I felt like, okay, I didn't die in Call of Cthulhu because the GM didn't give me the right information, or because the GM is having me do this weirdo encounter with rules I'm not really ready to play with, right? I died because, yeah, it's Call of Cthulhu, and if you don't make your skill checks, you might die. Right? But the skill check, I had high skill rolls, right? But if you go back and watch, I still failed, right? 80% chance and roll a 96, right? It's roll under. It's like City of Heroes when you have 95% and you miss anyway, right? Bad rolls happen. That's fine. But even though I successfully completed Crater Lake with my third character, I never had a problem after that first encounter. Everything worked okay. Even though I successfully completed it, and I've never successfully completed a Call of Cthulhu solo adventure, my characters always die or go insane. Always die. I don't think they've ever gone insane, which is disappointing because I've always wanted to have that happen. I still like the Call of Cthulhu adventures better, and I played them more than once. I went back and played them. In addition to playing them on my channel, I went back and played them again. And actually, one of them is, I didn't actually do this one yet, into Alone Against the Dark. Is meant to be played repeatedly with multiple pre-gen characters. They give you 4, and you get scores for like how well each character does as you go through it. And each one learns a little more. And so basically the idea is, if you play it correctly, if you get lucky and you play it well, by the time the 4th character goes through it, they will find enough clues from the previous 3 characters that they can actually solve it, I think. I've not done it yet. It requires a lot of time, and I just haven't had a chance. I was hoping maybe this summer I would sit down and actually just take a week of my time and sit down and play it a few hours each day and just really have fun with it. I probably won't post it, but this is where, like, I'm never going to play Crater Lake again. I found that an incredibly frustrating adventure. But I'm sitting here talking about, oh yeah, I want to play these Call of Cthulhu adventures again and play them multiple times and see if I can beat them this time and that sort of stuff. Why? Because the company, the GM, in Call of Cthulhu played fair with me, right? And gave me a chance to learn how to play the game and didn't try to give me this really hard challenge right out of the gate. And the Crater Lake GM was like, nah, you didn't buy Long John's -2 to your vigor roll. Aha, you got fatigue. Oh, now you're in difficult terrain and you're shooting this guy and you can't shoot him anywhere but in his head, but you didn't know that, so he keeps getting up and he's going to kill you. Right? I mean, that's not a way to create a starting adventure for new players. So, the lesson here is that when you're going to start new players off in a new role-playing game, when you give them challenges, they should be straightforward. Not necessarily super easy, but straightforward to begin with, right? The trap should be fairly obvious the first time there's a trap, right? You don't make this super complicated, impossible to detect trap that nobody would think to even do an investigation or a notice roll on, right? Because the players aren't ready for that, and you're going to catch them, and you might kill some of them. And although death should be on the table, you don't want it to be like you're fools mating them, right? It's the same reason that even though you probably could fools mate a new player or scholars mate them, you shouldn't in chess. Because that's not going to be any fun for them, and it's not going to make them want to play the game, right? The only reason I finished the Crater Lake Chronicles was because I am stubborn, and I was determined to finish it. I didn't finish it because it was fun. Because it wasn't. I was frustrated. I felt like they were making me keep track of too many things. It was very hard to both run and play. And never going to go back and play it again. Right? So you want to be very careful to make sure that your players are getting an enjoyable experience that helps them learn how to play the game, right? The idea is, just like with chess, right? You want to be easy on them enough, I mean, not easy, but straightforward enough with them enough that they can learn the basics enough, that they get far enough into playing the game so that they actually like playing it and they're sophisticated enough that you can then throw the harder stuff at them. right? Yeah, they don't fight Firewing right away, but if you get your players playing enough champions so that they get enough experience that they're good at it, you can throw Firewing at them with other villains in the battle the way I did, and they can handle it, right? You could throw Overlord at them like I did, and they can handle it, right? The guy you can't pierce his armor because he's got hardened defenses, and he's got all these defenses against NNDs, and he's got defense against ego attacks and presence attacks and everything else, and he's got enhanced senses, so you can't stop him with darkness field, and he's got flash defense, so you can't flash him. All that stuff was true of Overlord. They still beat him, but they were experienced, right? You don't throw a villain like that at a bunch of new players, even if you give them 500-point pre-gen characters, because they're not going to know how to handle it. They don't have enough experience, right? So make sure when you're teaching people how to play a role-playing game that you use appropriate, straightforward challenges. Don't use a bunch of exceptions to the rules and unusual stuff. You don't start your first D&D encounter, even if the player characters might have magic weapons. You don't start your first D&D encounter with some enemy that's resistant to non-magic weapons. Yes, it's a totally valid thing to do in D&D, and that's fine to do after the players know what they're doing. But at the beginning, that's going to completely screw them up. They're not going to even know what to do. It's not taking damage. It may not occur to them, if they're new, that magic weapons are different than non-magic weapons in this regard. Like, this actually happened in my game group, and they weren't brand new. They were 4th level. They fought an Iron Cobra, and I believe Iron Cobras, if I remember right, are resistant to any non-magic weapon, right? Which means it's doing half damage. They might even be immune. I can't remember now. So, the sorcerer was able to cast a spell at it, I guess, but, the other characters attacked it and just clanged off of it, didn't do anything. So, the ranger's character had a regular sword, short sword, but she also had a +1 dagger, and she was a 2-weapon fighter. And she attacked it with her short sword, and it didn't do anything. So she said, well, I guess there's no point to attacking with the dagger, so I won't bother. And I'm sure the other players were like, but. They didn't say anything to her, right? Because she was a new player, and they wanted her to have the opportunity to discover how the game works for herself. But as a new player, her logic was, well, the dagger only does D4, and the short sword does D6, and she was using the dagger in her offhand, so I think she didn't do as much damage with it in her offhand. I can't remember now. So she just logically thought, yeah, there's no point to using the dagger on this thing if the short sword didn't hurt it. And so I think somebody said to her, well, I mean, you've got it in your hand. It's a bonus action. You're not going to do anything else. You may as well do it. And she's like, well, okay, but it's probably not going to do anything. And then she hit it, and she damaged it. And I said, this seems to do the normal amount of damage that you would expect to do to a big cobra, right? And it cut it, and the thing hissed in pain, right? And so I figured, okay, she gets it now, right? The next round, she almost didn't do it again. She was like, well, I just rolled really high. What are the odds I'm going to roll another 4, right? So she didn't realize that in D&D there is a mechanic of resistance to non-magic weapons. All the other players knew that because they played other versions of D&D before. Even if they hadn't played 5th, and I think they all had played 5th before. So I can imagine my best friend was like probably practically bit his tongue off, not saying anything, right? I was struggling with it because as a GM, I don't want to tell them what to do, right? And so I was trying to, as descriptively as possible, telegraph that the cobra kind of glared at the dagger and hissed at her and stuff. Finally, she realized I need to be at the forefront here, and I need to beat this thing with my dagger. And then the spellcasters, of course, helped her with spells, and it worked, right? But again, as a new player, you can't assume that the new player is going to figure this mechanic out. It's not necessarily an obvious mechanic, right? And so it's obvious if you know D&D, but if you've never played D&D before, it's not necessarily an obvious mechanic. And so this is what I'm saying. You don't want to hit players with this kind of a mechanic that they might not know about in the very first encounter, right? By the time this happened, they were 4th level. And they actually had magic arrows. She had them in her quiver. And the dwarf, who was an NPC, but one of the players was playing him for me in combat. He said, "Can the dwarf go over and just take some magic arrows out of her quiver so that he could start shooting them?" And I said, "Okay, make." He made some sort of a roll. I can't remember, a dex roll or something, and he got hold of them, and then he started shooting it with the +1 arrows. But it was just sort of, this is a great example of the only character in the party that had the magic weapons was the one who did not know how this mechanic worked, right? And the party could have wiped because of it if she hadn't finally figured it out. And I actually worried about that, and I thought, well, the spellcasters can do stuff to him, and they were able to. And one of the things that happened is the sorcerer ended up waking it up, so he was in melee with it, and so he had to try to get away from it before he could try to cast spells because he didn't want to get bitten. And so that complicated things too. But my point is, even though it was an experienced player at that point, she'd been playing D&D for, I don't know, 10 or 12 sessions, she still struggled with that mechanic because it wasn't a standard mechanic that you're used to. So when you're starting out new players, you should always try to stick to the really simple, basic, standard mechanics first. And then when the players have some experience with those mechanics, then you can go ahead and do the more complicated stuff, right? Because now they have experience and they've done it before. Does that make sense? And so hopefully that's helpful. I didn't want to rag too much on Crater Lake, but I really don't like that adventure, and I would never do what they did to a group of new players. Like literally, this is supposed to be a tutorial, and you're doing that. Like, I don't know. I just think it was not very well done. Okay, so I'm going to need to get to the top of this thing, but before we do that, let's switch to the bottles, and I've got tons of cleaning liquid now, and we're doing metal. And that should clean that off. There we go. I think I also can buy a bunch more stuff, right? Oh, no, everything's out of stock. We can actually buy this heavy-duty nozzle, and then we can get attachments for it. What was that called? Prime Vista 3000. Okay, so we can get stuff for the Prime Vista 3000. Prime Vista 3000. Prime Vista 3000. Prime Vista 3000. Where's the soap nozzle for that? There it is. Oh, do we have it already? I guess we have it already. So now we can actually change to the Prime Vista 3000. Do the short extension. Okay, and can we do the soap here with this? Yeah, it's weird. It doesn't seem like we can do soap with it. But this is sort of the new, our new piece of equipment, which is pretty cool. So it'll do more pressure, I think. So guys, go ahead and leave in the comments. Tell me about your experiences as a GM. Have you had to teach new people how to play a role-playing game, and how have you approached it? Has anybody here besides me tried the Crater Lake adventure? And if so, what'd you think of it? Did you think, no, I'm just a I'm just a wuss who couldn't figure out how to play the game. Um, Let me know what you think. I mean, if you played it before, maybe you liked it. I didn't see anybody on the forum who liked it. Actually, most people were quite critical of it. Um, so anyway, let me know. So one thing I do want to mention here with what I'm doing is you might want to know, like, why do I wash it first with the pressure and then come in with the soap? And the reason is I just don't have that much of the metal soap. And so if we were to do the whole wall, it would take a lot more soap, and then I wouldn't have it for stuff that I need it for. And you could see, like, I was able to do that one without needing the soap, right? Usually you need the soap for things like graffiti or rust or that kind of thing, and you don't really need it for, like, algae and stuff like this. I think it's really cool in this game that they actually differentiated that. That's pretty neat. All right, folks, so I think we're going to stop here. Since I have a different one that I've started already, and we're only 29% full here, I think I'm going to go do the other mission when I'm not recording with you guys, and hopefully I'll let you guys, as we'll do a couple more rants using this map, and you'll see the whole thing go from dirty to clean. But at least we've cleaned the surfaces of the roofs and this little thing, and we'll do the rest in the next episode. Until then, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Power Wash Simulator. Let's rant with Scrapper.